Hello and welcome to the History Trail. This week we're at Freshford in North Somerset. Situated in an idyllic valley between the rivers Avon and Frome, there's been a village here since Roman times. Freshford's streets and lanes are very distinctive because they're steep and winding, full of picturesque houses, mostly clad in Bath stone quarried locally. Quiet and idyllic it may look now, but until quite recently, Freshford was an industrial village, offering employment for hundreds of hands in two large woolen mills beside the river Frome. And the local brewery is no longer fermenting the local ale. It's become a private house, but its windows and chimney remain to remind us of its original use. However, the village inn is pulling pints, attracting many visitors because of its beautiful location on the banks of the River Frome and close to a bridge dating right back to the 16th century. Today we're lucky enough to bring the History Trail team to Freshford Manor. This building has changed quite a lot over the years. Back in Elizabethan days, the original house was sold for less than £50 and was later lived in by one of the wealthiest men in England, John Ashe, an active parliamentarian during the Civil War. The present owner, Neil Mattingly, is an enthusiastic local historian, and he's dedicated one of the corridors of his home to the history of the house and surrounding area. Joining the regular team of John Chandler and Chris Tomkovich are Alan Dodge, a local historian, and conservator Helen Moody. Neil has very kindly given us the run of the whole house to use as a venue for the roadshow, and we start in the magnificently restored conservatory, where Chris is talking to three generations of the Torrington family, who've brought in a songbook with an amazing story attached to it.
There's a hole here.
Yeah, that's, in fact, it goes all the way through, sort of halfway into the book if you open it up. In fact, it just happened, luckily.
That's a piece of shrapnel.
Yeah, that's correct. My grandfather was a musician, a bandsman, and he was in a place near Zélibeek in France, and they were walking down a road and they came under shell fire from the Germans, and there was a chateau nearby which they dived into for cover, and there was a music room, and he had a quick look around and saw this book lying on the floor, I presume.
So he picked it up.
Yeah, so obviously he being interested in music, he picked it up and had a quick look and thought, yeah, this is interesting, I'll keep hold of this, and put it in his backpack. The shelling stopped, they left the chateau, walked down the road, and a few minutes later the shelling started again, and the next thing he knows he's on the deck.
Well, he was actually sort of flattened by the force of this.
I would believe so, yes, so I've been told. And when he got back to camp, he took out the music book and saw the hole. A piece of shrapnel was lodged virtually, you can see, right in the middle.
It's an amazing story. It's three generations of your family that probably wouldn't be here today then without this book.
We're quite pleased that he picked it up, yes.
Dave's grandfather survived, but so many men never came home. Virtually every village and town in England has a war memorial to commemorate the men lost in the two world wars, and Freshford is no exception. I'm going to show you what a useful resource they can be for family history. I find it incredible and very sad that 18 young men from a small village of Freshford gave their lives during the First World War. I think people are fascinated by war memorials, and when you see your surname on there, you think, well, could that person be related to me? And of course these days it is possible to find out quite easily if that's the case. I'm writing down the names of the men from Freshford who died in the two world wars, so that I can find out more details about them on the internet. Remember to make a note of every piece of information, including the regiment, as it will help you to identify them correctly. As a family historian, I use the internet a great deal, and today I'm going to use one of my favourite sites to research the war dead of Freshford. The site is called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It contains the names and commemorative places of 1.7 million of the Commonwealth forces who died in the First and Second World War. Now, it's a very, very popular site and receives 250,000 hits per week, so it can be slow to access, but it's brilliant. The clearest way for me to show you how to use this particular website is to select a relatively uncommon surname. So I'm going to choose Rice, because it is more of an unusual surname.
Yeah.
I'm going to type in Rice.
Now it's asking you which war.
Which
and
war,
then the year of death if you know it. Is
The
that
year
right?
of death if you did know it,
But we
yes.
don't know that, do we?
No. And then nationality. So nationality would be UK and former colonies.
Yeah. And how long is this going to take?
It varies. Right,
that was
that's
very,
good.
very good, wasn't
Now,
it?
there's
Yes.
12 records which match. Now, we've now got to hope that of those 12 races, that only one was in the Somerset Light Infantry, and we're lucky.
I see. So,
Only
yes,
one.
so it's very useful that we knew the regiment.
So there you go, Ernest Rice.
So we know his Christian name, Ernest.
We do. Now, do you notice the date of death?
1st of July 1916.
The very first day of the Battle of the Somme, the day of bright sunshine when 100,000 men went over the top, and by the end of the day, 60,000 were wounded and 20,000 were killed.
So that day has gone down in the history of every village in the country.
Betty Harris's mother used to run the village grocer's shop, and she's brought in an old signboard that has been languishing under the garden shed for years. Helen Moody has some advice for her.
Well, really, what this needs first of all is a jolly good brush off. And on the back here, you can use quite a stiff brush to get all the dust and dirt and cobwebs. On the front, where we have some paint remaining, you really want to be rather more careful. I don't know if you can see that the paint is flaking on the surface there. So you must use a very gentle brush here. I'd recommend that you leave it unvarnished if possible, because if you varnish it and you put a hard layer of a modern varnish on top, you may end up with the wood behind it reacting differently with the humidity in your kitchen, and it might crack and get worse. So try and leave it uncoated if you can. But to put it on display, why don't you make, or have made for you then, a frame which can go of wood all the way round the board with a backboard, and then you'd be able to put it on your wall in the kitchen.
Alan Dodge has just finished writing a history of the village and has brought in an old ledger which has been an invaluable aid in his research.
This book, which was a ledger of a blacksmith from Norton St Philip of the 1850s, was found in a garage inspection pit a couple of years ago. In Freshford. It's a very interesting record of this chap's accounts because he actually serviced a number of farmers in the vicinity of Norton St Philip, and also butchers and brewers and maltsters. And for each of these individual people, you can see the different things that he repaired.
What does it tell you about the business of a smith in the 1850s?
Well, it actually shows us that a smith was actually repairing all sorts of things in village life.
We often have billheads and photographs, and I think this is probably quite a rare survival, but this is relatively unusual. And I think, whereas anyone writing a local history will sort of bemoan the fact that the village shops closed, perhaps, to actually build up a picture, a kind of microcosm of shopping in the 19th century, is relatively rare to be able to do, and therefore that much more important.
For my walkabout this week, I'm joined by Alan, who knows so much about the village. This ruin of a once thriving textile mill is a reminder of the changing face of Freshford's industry. There was a time when the mill was a bustling place, turning wool into yarn. It was the main local employer in the area and also used to provide outwork for local weavers.
This is a very interesting cottage here, John. It's now one cottage, Rose Cottage, but it used to be at least 2, if not 4 weavers' cottages made into one house. And the front door would have been a passageway into 2 further behind, and from the passageway a door would have gone into each of the small cottages. Not only did they have the families in them, but the weaving looms were in the first floor, and there would have been a hive of activity with children and weaving and noise and shuttles flying, everything going on, all in this little place, which is so quiet and beautiful now.
So back up the hill to the manor house. The village now doesn't look like an industrial village. It's become gentrified. When did that happen?
Well, I suppose it's happened gradually. Towards the end of the 18th century, the influence of Bath was quite important, and local newspapers and sales of houses describe the village as very attractive, beautiful scenery. So from that period, people have been coming here just to live rather than to work.
And the fine architecture, even the village shop, the architecture is very grand.
Indeed, it was actually rebuilt around about 1830 by the Watts family, who actually became the Morrises later on. And this provided provisions for the village for at least 160 years until it closed.
And now it's an antique shop.
Indeed, that's a sign of the
It
times.
certainly is, isn't it?
This tennis court was originally in the grounds of a large property in Freshford called the Old House. About 20 years ago, a new house was built on the site, and today it's the home of Tony Doughty, who wants to find out more about an interesting feature in his garden. Tony's just brought in a very interesting photograph, and there's more he wants to know about it, I think, isn't there, Tony?
Well, we've lived in the house only 5 years, and when we bought the house, our understanding was that this had been built around about 1920 and was something to do with a tennis court. We're not sure at all about the age of this thing.
But this looks like a neoclassical temple, and
yes, very much so. It's the sort of thing that I've seen at Stourhead
exactly
in this area.
Exactly, which is really interesting, because if it is that old, then you've got your house built on the site of an 18th century landscape garden. Now, we don't know whether that's the case. This might be a very modern construction, of course. We can trace it back by looking at tithe maps and other maps of the area, and hopefully find it on there. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. That's the best way to approach it, I think, and then we'll see what we can find out.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Join us in part 2, when I go undercover, hoping to discover the origins of Tony's Roman temple. Hello and welcome back to the Freshford History Trail. Well, I'm here in Tony Doughty's garden having a look at his neoclassical temple, and as you can see, it's a pretty magnificent structure. It also looks disarmingly new, so what I need to do is try and work out its date. I'm not competent to do that, but I know someone who is, and if you want to find out this sort of thing, you've got to go to the top. You've all heard of Stourhead. I've got the assistant head gardener here, Alan Power. Alan, hi. Thanks very much for coming. I'm well.
Yeah,
but this is our neoclassical temple, or is it?
it is, isn't it? Well, as you said yourself, 'tis unalarmingly modern, isn't it?
Well, it looks that way to me, but that may just be well scrubbed.
Yeah, it may well be, but I certainly think looking at the columns here that you've got a difference between this one certainly and this one lower down.
It's rougher at the bottom.
The stone certainly looks older, doesn't it?
Okay.
And the other thing that does catch my eye is the top of the columns. It looks ever so unfinished. I know back certainly in the 18th century and early 19th century they were very, very particular. If they were going to spend money on something, it's got to be right. And looking at the overlap up there, you're not getting the perfection that they were looking for.
Could some of it be older? Maybe it's been restored.
The first thing my eye is drawn to is the floor.
Oh, right.
I mean, looking at the floor, I think the floor certainly predates the tops of these columns.
So are there any other aspects of this that would tell you it was 18th century?
Well, positioning of these temples was the major part of it. They weren't going to put these temples somewhere that you weren't going to look at anything. So, I mean, as we can see, positioning of the temple, you're looking at an absolutely fantastic view out here.
Of the Frome Valley.
It's magnificent, isn't it? Right. But it's not only the view out in front of you. The front of these temples are open, so you're going to have a view right back to the mansion as well, back to the house.
To the left, and another one to the right.
And another one to the right.
There's nothing much to see at the moment, but you would assume there'll be something down there to see from inside the temple. A pretty good way to find out who owned what in the Victorian period is to look at a tithe map. an enterprising attempt to match property to its owners, which reveals field boundaries and buildings, old tracks and pathways, and long-gone signs of planting. And I've got the tithe map here, which is about 1836 of Freshford.
Excellent.
And so, although we were possibly dealing with a new structure down there at the temple, I think we can see from here, there's the old house, that's Cooper's house, and this here looks to me like the temple. It's on a wall. What do you think?
It does, doesn't it? And in line with the river where we looked at that.
Yeah, that's pretty much the view
earlier.
we just had, but there's an intriguing spot
there is,
at the end here.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but that might be something to look at. Okay, well, if you want to find a tithe map like this, you should be able to find one in your county record office. The other thing you might find there actually is paintings and pictures of an area. And we've been having a look for things like that, haven't we? And we've got some
really interesting ones,
really interesting 18th and 19th century pictures of the garden as it used to be. My favourite one is actually this, an old drawing we found in the local library of Freshford in 1870, and we can see very clearly on this drawing a building here right in the right position. There's Cooper's house, there's a classical temple.
Absolutely.
So it's at least 130
There's
years
there,
old.
isn't there? Yeah.
And we've got one here of Freshford which appears to show a structure on top of the hill here. But then we've got these two really interesting and amazing paintings, both views of Freshford, which show this structure on top of a hill, which again looks to me, looking at the position of the river, looking at the fall of the land around, could well be our missing view. And it also appears in this one, same building, I think, from a slightly different angle. What sort of building is that?
I mean, it looks like a gazebo.
Right.
That type effect. You know, you would visit a temple like this to view the valley below.
What is a gazebo exactly?
It's similar to a summer house. You would go and enjoy the afternoon in it, go and enjoy the views from it.
Is it true that it's called a gazebo because you gaze about?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's exactly where it's come from.
Okay. So Alan and I decided we had to search out the lost gazebo, which would have been one of the views from the temple. Over the years, the gardens have been neglected and nature has taken its course. But we were in luck. Under all that new growth, we found evidence of the past.
Ah, well, excellent.
There's a view. Right, from the tithe map, I'd say we are, in fact, just there.
We've arrived, haven't we?
Which is the gazebo, I think. And looking along our line boundary wall there, that we thought was a boundary wall, there it goes.
Straight down.
Stretching straight down. Yeah. That would go straight to the temple, wouldn't it?
It would do, past that tree.
Okay, so we'd have a view that way from here. I mean, this is actually really high. We're at a very high position, aren't we?
Yeah. It doesn't feel like it because we feel quite enclosed because of these trees.
Because of all these trees. But would these trees have been there in the 18th century?
Looking at the trees around here, a lot of it is natural regeneration, and that, you know, they've just come on as natural seedlings because the area hasn't been managed. And certainly the two mature trees in the centre of this paddock, they've come up in the past 60, 70 years.
Right.
So you're looking at a clear view out over the valley again, which is magnificent.
So Alan, what can you conclude?
Well, I think certainly after seeing the temple down there, discovering this fantastic little mystery up here, and you know, I think we can conclude that this is definitely the southernmost tip of our little garden that we're looking for. Linked in really well, you know, the views link in together, both looking out over the valley. I think we can't but conclude that it's part of it, which is very exciting for us.
Now, Sonia Knowles was born in the village, and she's brought in a real cornucopia of photographs and memorabilia about the village. Harold is in several photographs. He was your father-in-law, and when do we think this looks like a man in the 20s or 30s?
Yes.
Is that before the war?
I would have thought that one was probably the 30s, perhaps, beginning of the war.
And one that struck me was this photograph, and he's tending a very well-kept garden, but it's not just a garden, is it?
No, it's the local railway station.
Oh yes, it's a signal, yes.
Yes, and they won lots and lots of prizes for their beautiful floral gardens, so they've won year after year, I think.
And have you got any of the certificates?
No, I've no idea what happened to the certificates.
It would be interesting to try and find them,
out,
wouldn't
yes.
it? Yes. The station's still there, but all this has been swept away.
Yes.
And I suppose that happened in the 1960s. You were lucky to keep the station facility at all.
So this is Freshford Station, still here, still open in fact. But it wouldn't win any prizes for the best kept station nowadays. The flower gardens have all gone. The station buildings, in fact, have gone. Now, Sonia's inquiry was quite specific. She wanted to know about the fate of the certificates that had once adorned the walls of the station waiting room. And I've discovered that, sadly, the certificates almost certainly were destroyed at the time that the station buildings were pulled down in the 1970s. But I have made another discovery, which I think is rather more interesting in a way. A book was published about Freshford during the war, anonymously. It doesn't tell you that it's Freshford, but it was written by a resident of Freshford called Fay Inchthorne, and she actually mentions the station garden, and this is what she says. We admired the station garden, which is very properly the pride of Mr. Winch's heart. He's looked after it for over 30 years. Passengers lean out of carriage windows to exclaim about it. Our station garden, I should think, is well known to everybody within a radius of 50 miles. In fact, I heard about it once in the north of Scotland.
This was how Freshford Station looked in 1953. Immortalise it forever. Explains.
These photographs from Mrs. Lane, who we bought the house from in 1974, and she felt that it was very important that these photographs and records stayed with whoever owned the house. So obviously I intend to pass them on if and when I move. And I think it's just a fascinating record of a film that was made in the village that was obviously very important to the whole community, really. The film was called the Titchfield Thunderbolt. They used the house, I think, for storing equipment and so on, and we're very grateful. So actually used the house to film a shot of Stanley Holloway coming out of the front door. This is where he's actually picking a rose from a rose bush which we had in the front garden for very many years.
And
then he walks up the front steps of...
well, those are the steps we saw in the earlier picture. That's
right.
These ones
yes,
here, isn't it?
Yes. And he turns, and what is our bedroom window, Mrs. Morris, who was actually a but she was in the film his wife, Mrs. Valentine, and she calls out to him from the window. So he climbs the steps and turns and looks at her, and then comes out of the front gate, and I think that's the end of that particular sequence.
Some of these photos are amazing, aren't they? Because they show us so many people here who obviously were people who lived in Freshford.
Absolutely.
And,
I mean,
you don't recognise anybody
well,
here?
sadly, not in these photographs. No. I mean, I do know one or two people who said, "Oh, I was in that film when I was a child." I mean, but of course, 1952 is quite a while away now.
I'm very taken by the way that these have been passed to you as part of the history of your house. So you're now entrusted with these,
that's right.
and then when you move on, these artefacts will remain in the house.
Absolutely,
and although we think of film as being a terribly recent thing, it's actually part of the cultural heritage of the village, isn't it? And I think that makes your house a bit of an archive. Beatrice Ward has brought in an evocative World War I memento, which used to belong to her father-in-law.
These were sent to the troops in the trenches in France during the Christmas 1914, with cigarettes and chocolates.
Yes, cigarettes, yes.
And
the inside.
Have you got the inside?
I've got the inside.
Now,
yes.
That is very unusual. The tins aren't so unusual, but it's very unusual to have the inside still. The photograph of Princess Mary, with best wishes for a happy Christmas and a victorious New Year from the Princess Mary and friends at home. I don't think it would have been a very happy Christmas in the trenches, actually.
No, I shouldn't think so, no.
And you've got a cine film of your wedding in 1943.
Yes.
In Freshford Church. Now, that's very unusual to have a cine film for 1943.
Good.
How did you manage that?
Well, my husband's friend had a camera, and he said, I will try it out at your wedding. And that was the way he came to my wedding.
So when's the last time you looked at this cine film?
At our silver wedding.
Silver wedding, so that's 32 years ago?
Yes.
Well, we've almost come to the end of another programme. We've had a marvellous time here in Freshford. Join us next week in Langport.
And if you'd like to find out more about the History Trail, there's a fact sheet you can send for, and we have a website, details of which will appear at the end of the programme.
And there's just time for me to say that we're now standing right where Beatrice Ward was married 57 years ago. She's not seen the cine footage that was shot on that day for more than 30 years. But we've got it laced up to a projector, so Beatrice, this is for you.